unspeakable horror, which was the massacre at the Shatila refugee camp. I worked very intensely as a political counselor in Beirut at that time with some truly great Americans on this end, and we were able to bring him and his brother to the U.S. Again, two among many, but these things count. They make a difference. We made a difference in your lives and those of your brother. Through the work you have done since you have been in this country, you have enriched all of our lives. So before I go into this now long sequence of doom and horror, I just wanted to get that out there, the small good things. So Turkey and Saudi Arabia, great subject. Let me tell you why. In very real and enduring ways, both countries have been absolutely critical U.S. partners in the aftermath of World War II. Turkey, a founding member of NATO. After World I, of course, Turkey no longer owned the Middle East as they had for centuries before under the Ottoman Empire, but was always a place of significant influence and indeed advice for us. So again, a critical NATO relationship that was there at the beginning, the foundation of NATO. A little bit different, obviously, with Saudi Arabia, but also an enduring relationship, again, that goes back to 1945. The war was not even over in Europe. February 1945, the historic meeting between a very ill FDR and Ibn Saud on the deck of a U.S. warship in Great Bitter Lake, the USS Quincy. That an alien president would make that trip out at that time and to have the meeting on a ship of war underscored the significance of what happened that day in February 1945. That forged the enduring relationship with the kingdom and through the kingdom with the heart of that region, based on the fundamental premise or transaction, if you will, although it became far more than that and is oil for security. Oil, of course, had been discovered in Saudi Arabia before the Second World War, but not really developed. Nonetheless, coming out of that war, we knew that clearly the largest reserves in the world were likely to be located in Saudi Arabia. So present at the creation, if you will. These relations go back very far and run very deep. In some respects, one could make the case that it's closer, perhaps, with Turkey because of the NATO membership, because we have still the use of Incirlik in Turkey as an air base, which has been crucial to a lot of what we've done and what we've done together against the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. It would have been a very different situation for us, for the region, and indeed internationally, had we not been able to base many of our operations out of Incirlik. So it becomes pretty important. Turkey stood with us in Korea. They kind of wanted their troops to go wherever it was hardest. I had a friend in later years who had been in the military. He was of Greek origin and spoke Greek, so was attached to Greek troops in Korea, and recounted the story that he said he saw time after time the Turks would be given whatever impossibly hard objective there was to go take. There would be this tremendous din of gunfire, plumes and clouds of smoke, and battle after battle. When the smoke cleared, there would be a Turkish flag on top of whatever the objective was. The point kind of being here, don't mess with the Turks. So we'll get into all kinds of things in the Q&A. So fast forward to where we are today with both. And you can say that if we are not in a relationship crisis with both, we've skated pretty close to it. And I think with both countries, could get better, could get worse. For those of you who may be a little bit newer to the region than I, bear in mind that as bad as things look in the Middle East, they in fact can get worse. I'm kind of the poster boy for that. There is no bottom. And again, I underscore here that Turkey in its post-World War I form, not an Arab land, does not control Arab lands in any occupational sense, but because of its unique position, can bring considerable influence to bear on what happens in the Middle East. When I left the Middle East for what I thought was the last time as an ambassador, early 2009, I looked back with real gratitude for the Turkish role in Iraq at a critical time. We had negotiated a very difficult set of agreements, one on security, and that is something that served as a framework for our forces going forward, and another, a much broader political agreement that we envisioned at the time being the basis for an ongoing relationship in Iraq and beyond Iraq, something the U.S. had never had before with any Iraqi government. The complexity of politics at that time meant that it isn't over till it's over, and then it isn't over. Foreign Minister Zabari and I signed the agreement in October 2008. By signing it, we closed it. It would mean that it would go up to the Iraqi parliament for ratification with only an up or down vote possible. The text would not be reopened. We worked hard, and we got that positive vote. But then, because democracies are complicated, there was also the issue of the vice president signing off on it, one of whom was Tarek al-Hashimi, representing largely the Sunni community. And he, I think with perfect reason, had a lot of questions that we sought to answer. Most critically at that time, so did the Turkish envoy, with whom we worked very, very closely. He had a connection that went back years with Iraq, and I have always thought that bringing the vice president finally aboard on that agreement had a great deal to do with the Turkish rule. I mean, these are things that do not make the headlines, that no one knows about unless you're out there. How personalities count, how histories count, and a little bit about how to try to manage those. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and take any whacks at a given administration. Maybe I actually will. I mean, again, looking at the moment here, both Turkey and Saudi Arabia are in a process of significant internal change. In Turkey, of course, with the ascension of President Erdogan, he has really remade the entire pulp mill structure inside of Turkey. Something I never dreamed I would see with respect to the Turkish armed forces, the Turkish army. I just as luck would have it, I got to be in Istanbul for two of the coups, 1970 and 1980, So had a certain sense of the resilience of Turks. I mean, the restaurants stayed open, the bars stayed open, and traffic was way down. It was kind of nice. But it also left me with the sense that we're just going to have to live with the fact that the Army is never going to be checked by a civilian government. Well, that happened. And continues to go on happening, if you will. So what role does President Erdogan now envision in the Middle East? I'm not going to start going on here about the Kurds because I know that'll come up and we can address it there. Just pointing at, just saying. It's not that I forgot it. It's just something I don't want to try to deal with in these remarks. So what's the look forward? What's the outlook beyond Idlib? What's the outlook beyond Manbij? These are places that no one had ever heard of in this country, but then we never heard of an obscure archduke in an even more obscure town called Sarajevo in August 1914. There are any number of flashpoints as we look ahead on Syria. And I know we're going to talk about that too. In the meantime, dust off your Barbara Tuchman book, The Guns of August, the war that nobody wanted and everybody got, and apply that to some of the developments in Syria now involving the Syrian regime, the Israelis, the Turks, the Russians, and you can kind of see how World War I got started. Again, I won't predict doom here. I'll let my colleagues do it and all of you. Again, in Saudi Arabia, we no longer rely on Saudi oil, but boy, believe me, our friends do, particularly our friends in Asia, Japan and South Korea, for example. So the question, and I don't have the answer, I hope it will come out of our conversation, is our special relationship with these two countries now going somewhere that it really has not been effectively since 1945. And that would be somewhere not good. With Saudi Arabia, is it going to be the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, someone that I think probably everyone in this room has had some contact with, and the war in Yemen? We've all seen in this building how the Senate now has reacted to that, both the killing and the war. Where's that going to take us? Where is a completely new leadership approach with the ascension of Mohammed bin Salman? Where's that going to take the relationship if we get over these current challenges? Because this is different. And in Turkey, to a very large degree, I believe that where we are in Turkey has a lot to do with the Europeans, quite frankly. Because basically, over time, the message from the EU became pretty clear. You Turks, you're certainly good enough to be a founding member of NATO, so you can fight and die for us, should that need arise, but you're never going to be good enough to join the Gentlemen's Club of the European Union. I believe, and I put this out there and, so that you can tear it apart, that had something not insignificant to do with the rise of a politician who could tap into that sense of being dissed by the West, to take the message to Anatolia, not simply the drawing rooms of Istanbul or Ankara, and develop a really impressive popular constituency, something his predecessors did not have. So I'm sure we'll talk about this and in a much more authoritative way. I did want to lay that out there. The last thing I'll say here, because it's what I know the least about, the ideological or theocratical differences between the two that we may be seeing play out a bit in the Khashoggi incident. The leadership of both Turkey and Saudi Arabia have an ideology, if you will, that they support. In Saudi Arabia, of course, it's the Salafi trend, persistently and wrongly labeled Wahhabism in this country and much of the West. It's not, and Dr. Ibish can explain all about that. In Turkey, with President Erdogan, it's the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood comes in a huge variety of flavors. One of them would be the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, which was way off on the far end of the scale, meaning that they were very big on car bombs, truck bombs, bomb bombs, anything else they could make blow up in Damascus or Aleppo or elsewhere, this going through the 1970s. Hafiz al-Assad and Brother Rifat cornered him in Hama, and everybody in this room knows what happened February 1982. Nobody outside this room has a clue, but had a significant amount to do with the civil war that broke out in 2011. At the other end of the continuum, I would suggest you would find, say, the Muslim Brothers in Turkey and in Iraq as pledged to the system, and indeed in the case of Turkey, certainly it is a system through President Erdogan. So this notion that we should, label the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization is as dangerous as it is idiotic, quite frankly. I mean, who are we going to talk to in Iraq? Who are we going to talk to in Turkey? And if you want to talk about an assault on the democratically elected leader of a NATO member, that would be it, at least in my view. Muslim Brothers in Egypt, of course, eschewed violence years ago, and as the only organized non-state-controlled political apparatus after the fall of Mubarak, positioned to win the elections as they did. And we all know how that's gone since. Again, I pose these out there as questions for my colleagues to address. Again, in particular, the role of Islamic ideology in both countries, or lack thereof. Maybe it's all completely overstated. I just don't know. But we need to talk about it, and that has a lot to do, in my view, of the crisis in the Gulf, if you will, between Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the state of Qatar, which has, I don't know how many Muslim Brothers are in the state of Qatar, but they have certainly assisted Muslim Brotherhood organizations outside, to the extreme displeasure of the Saudis. So it is a immensely tangled set of issues that we're wrestling with here. My bottom line, I suppose, is as frustrating and difficult as they are, they're also extremely important. Do we really want to lurch forward farther into the 21st century with our relationships with both of these powers and their seminal relationships in tatters and getting worse? Do they? And what's the way forward? So having posed all the questions, thank you for allowing me that opportunity. I turn it over to my colleagues who will produce all the answers. Thank you.
Are there any questions yet to be picked up on the cards? Our staff will come around and get them. Hussein, please.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. That's certainly a tough act to follow. Thank you all for coming. The key word in the title of this symposium is rivalry, right? And I think what it gets at is the unstable nature of the relations between Ankara and Riyadh, how multifaceted they are, how changing they are. And I want to try to kind of describe that, and particularly from a Gulf Arab point of view, or at least a Saudi point of view. But I think what sets the stage for this more than anything else as Ambassador Crocker was saying, is that the turn by Turkey away from the West and towards the East, largely because of the rebuff of the EU that helped to give rise, as you suggested, to the AKP in general and Erdogan in particular. Turkey's vision of the epicenter of its foreign policy shifted from an engagement with Europe to an engagement with the Middle East, looking back at its former imperial lands and to its fellow Muslim countries in the Arab world and other parts of the Islamic world. And this is a core element of Erdogan's ideology, of the AKP appeal, of the alliance that they have with other forces in Turkey. So it can't be understated, the extent to which Erdogan has ridden this wave and also then led Turkey in that direction can't really be overstated. And that, of course, has greatly altered the nature of the Saudi-Turkish relationship. And this is all even, of course, exacerbated by the sort of very aggressive, especially domestic, but even regional approach that the AKP and Erdogan have taken after the failed coup of 2016. That's, again, that just simply emphasized. So every time this process has gone through a change, it has been emphasized, and there's a kind of distillation going on here. So it's very important. And what you end up with is a situation where very recently, in the context of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, as you say, a good friend, more than one senior Turkish leader said Turkey is the only logical leader of the Islamic world. Now, whether that means the whole Ummah or the Sunni Ummah or whatever, it doesn't really matter. It is really, in a certain sense, a direct challenge to Saudi Arabia, which presents itself as the logical leader on the grounds of history, on the grounds of geography, on the grounds of custodianship of the holy sanctuaries, and this unstated position since the beginning of the third Saudi state in the 20s, that only Saudi Arabia has a pure Islamic system that relies on the Quran and not any kind of written constitution and whatnot. So, when you've got a Turkey that sees itself not as an integral part of Europe, but as the only rational leader of the Muslims of the world, you've got a rivalry situation with Saudi Arabia, I think, by definition. I wouldn't want to try to characterize the way Turkey sees its own foreign policy, because I'm not an expert in Turkey, and because I think it's also very hard, though my colleagues will do this, it's become very difficult, at least for me, to see where Turkish national interests, as they are defined by the state, and the political interests of the AKP and the personal interests of President Erdogan begin. This is, it seems to me, a fuzzy line. Now, maybe our colleagues can educate us, but so for me, that makes it a bit difficult. But describing the situation from a Saudi perspective, just tell you basically how Riyadh looks at Turkey, and it will explain a lot of things. And first of all, I do think Saudi Arabia sees Turkey, first of all, as a rival, just in those terms, another large state in the region with allies and with a strong military and with a major presence that is capable of projecting power and has to be taken seriously as another large state. Second, I think that that's offset by seeing Turkey as a necessary balance or ballast against Iran. The major Gulf Arab concern since 1979, and particularly since 2003, has been the idea of a revolutionary hegemonic Iran, which is both aggressively Shiite and revolutionary at the same time, and Persian. It combines all these kind of very threatening identitarian qualities that has scared the Gulf countries, and especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, very greatly, and that Turkey under almost any circumstance, it looks a lot less threatening than that. I mean, it's very hard to imagine Turkey being seen as having quite that mix of threatening characteristics. So Turkey is an obvious, necessary ballast against Iranian influence. But at the same time, Turkey is another potential hegemon now that it's looking east, right? And I think that there are places in the Arab world, including in the Gulf, where memories of Ottoman rule are not extinguished, where talk about the only rational leadership of the Islamic world hits hard, where the Turkish efforts to cultivate their regional alliances with, for example, with Qatar and with Muslim Brothers and others in the region, which I'll talk more about, are seen as evidence of this growing potential hegemonic agenda, right? And of course, the neo-Ottoman rhetoric that sometimes is engaged in by various Turks, including AKP people and such, and friends of the AKP, is noticed in the Gulf, and it's taken note of, and it's taken exception to. So now, I think this is more along the lines of a potential issue rather than an immediate one or a real one, but it's very much there. What's more alarming, and this is where you can see how the Khashoggi murder has brought this last anxiety to the fore, is the idea of Turkey as the leader of a rival third camp in the Middle East. And I think almost everyone accepts the idea that there are two rival camps in the Middle East. One is a kind of pro-Iranian alliance, mostly Shiites, also Bashar al-Assad and a few others, some Lebanese Christians as well, but mostly a Shiite alliance. Even the Houthis are part of this in a weird way, even though they're not 12 or Shiites, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that everyone, I think, accepts that there is a pro-Iranian camp. And generally speaking, those opposed to Iran are seen as comprising a second camp, no matter how loose it may be. I mean, obviously, when you've got Israel and the Gulf states in the same kind of general camp, it's not much of a camp since they don't have relations, even though they're working on building relations. It's much less, let's say, vertically integrated than the Iranian one is, and that's a real problem for this camp. But I think it's fair to say there is a distinctly anti-Iranian camp led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and you could look at it as a pro-American camp, or you could call it whatever you like. Now, many people end at that, but not the Gulf Arabs. The Gulf Arabs, the Saudis and the Emiratis would say, oh no, there is a third camp. There is a third distinct camp. And it is the Sunni Islamist camp, and it is led by Turkey, and it includes brotherhood parties all over the Middle East and Qatar. And this is an ideological camp, and that's one of the reasons why we have a boycott of Qatar, and it's one of the reasons why we're so upset, is that we see that this group is not loyal to the anti-Iranian cause. It's really kind of Turkish-oriented. And I think while there's a sense that Turkey helps to balance Iran, there's also an understanding that Turkey and Iran historically do not go to war, and Turkey and Iran are not going to fight it out. And it's very hard to imagine a situation where the Turks and the Iranians don't do some kind of deal in any given situation to share their interests. And this is not making anyone in the Gulf sleep any easier. In other words, it's easy to imagine the Turks and the Iranians just splitting the difference at their expense, right? So this is highly alarming. And then when they imagine the rise of a third camp, which is completely beyond their control, it looks like the whole region is fragmenting, and it looks like a net loss to them, right? Because this camp would not be in the pro-Iranian corner. It ought to be, this thinking goes, part of a Saudi-led pro-American alliance, right? And what are the Qataris doing playing footsie with the Turks? Why are the Turks running around trying to build alliances in our back? Everyone should be working together in coordination with the United States to offset Iranian hegemony. And this just looks like a terrible kind of betrayal of that. And so here, I think, is the epicenter of concern right now is the idea that Turkey is the leader of this rival camp. And actually, the thinking goes even further. It's almost always unstated. But there is this deep fear that this third camp, if it exists at all, I mean, many people would say it doesn't, but this third camp could evolve into the most dangerous thing imaginable, really, which is an alternative to the current pro-American camp of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and a very loose arrangement with the Israelis and the Egyptians and others to kind of stabilize the region. In other words, it's imaginable I think from a Gulf nightmarish perspective, that the United States would conclude that this alliance is fundamentally unworkable, dysfunctional, falls apart. It would look at the GCC, having completely fallen to pieces over Qatar, and with, Kuwait even moving away and whatnot. And I think there's a concern that if the pro-Turkish camp, the Sunni Islamist camp, could strengthen enough, you could see it not only vertically integrating, but starting to bring in other countries that are nominally part of the pro-Saudi camp, but could conceivably defect. And I'm talking here particularly about Kuwait and Jordan. So in other words, you can imagine a bloc of Turkey, Jordan, Qatar, and Kuwait providing an alternative ballast for the United States against Iran in a much more vertically integrated alliance. Now, you could easily turn around and say, look, Washington is not going to get in bed with a Muslim Brotherhood coalition. The Jordanians are not going to join this. What are you talking about? I'm not talking about a reality. I'm talking about an anxiety, but it's a very real anxiety. It's often unstated, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't convey that nightmare scenario to you, because it's very much out there. And you could see all of this playing out in the context of the Khashoggi affair. And I think the Khashoggi affair really kind of tells you where relations are. Because, and particularly if you look at how Turkey managed this scandal, it was very, very deftly done by Erdogan and his people. What they saw this as a great opportunity to bedevil and hobble a regional rival, right? And they did that. Saudi Arabia in general, and Mohammed bin Salman in particular, were kind of targeted, and the drip of information, the mixing of credible information with absolutely lurid exaggeration. They're hard to exaggerate the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, but they managed to do it, like live dismemberment and slow cutting off of fingers, stuff that's no longer at all discussed. This hilarious idea that the whole thing was transmitted live on his Apple Watch. Really kind of silly stuff, all mixed together to make sure that this story did not leave the front page for weeks and weeks, right? And then in a kind of uncoordinated partnership with the Washington Post that wanted to keep, quite rightly, considered this a killing in the family, and is still hammering away at it, which I think is perfectly understandable. But at the same time, Turkey did not want to precipitate a rupture with Saudi Arabia, because it doesn't serve what serves their interests is to weaken Saudi Arabia, but not create a total meltdown. So there was never a public accusation against Mohammed bin Salman from senior Turkish leaders. It was all it was implicit, or it was said by anonymous officials in the media. It was always deniable. And President Erdogan has gone to great lengths to shield King Salman from any question. And I mean, it's a little unusual. It doesn't really withstand scrutiny, because the king is, Mohammed bin Salman is not the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia the way, say, Mohammed bin Zayed is the de facto leader of Abu Dhabi. He's maybe a day-to-day ruler, but I don't know anyone who's serious about Saudi politics who doesn't recognize that the king retains ultimate authority here. Major national decisions are not being made against the wishes of the king. That's just not where we are here. And he's not a vegetable who can't be consulted the way some other titular leaders may be. That's not the situation. Otherwise, you wouldn't have seen this grand tour of Asia, which he managed to pull off recently enough that we can be pretty sure about. Now, outsourcing day-to-day administration to somebody else is not the same as relinquishing authority. So when Erdogan writes in the Washington Post that I am absolutely sure that King Salman had nothing to do with this and no knowledge of it, hint, hint, hint about his son, but not actually saying it, and therefore this does not constitute an act of policy. Therefore, we do not have to break relations with Saudi Arabia. It tells you exactly the kind of narrow tightrope that the Turks very successfully, not walked along, but danced merrily up and down on with great success. And I think they did manage to greatly strengthen their hand and greatly weaken the Saudi reputation, particularly the Crown Prince, create all kinds of headaches for the Saudi government. And also managed to unload Brunson, right? Pastor Brunson, who was useful for a while and then became an unbelievable headache. And the question was, how do we get rid of this guy without looking like we've caved into the Americans? Oh, this was a perfect opportunity. So they released Brunson, right? Get all the credit with Trump. Nobody in Turkey said, oh, you've caved to the Americans. They all said, what a brilliant move. What a smart guy you are. So it was just perfect. It was like excising a rotten tooth or something. It was just great. So I'm actually impressed with the skill with which this was handled. And I think what it shows you is how bipolar, and I use that term advisedly, Turkish-Saudi relations are within the context of this rivalry. They're pendular, right? They tend to swing back and forth between cooperation, particularly when it comes to reducing the role of Iran or in some other instances, versus a kind of unstated cooperation. And I think if you look at the way their relations have developed on Syria, you can see how that works really well. When the uprising began in earnest, both Turkey and Gulf countries were supporting armed Sunni rebel groups, sometimes, especially in the case of Qatar, the same groups, sometimes groups that were operating in coordination, and there was really a fairly close alliance to try to get rid of al-Assad. After the joint intervention by Iran and Russia in 2015, the bolstering of saving of al-Assad, let's put it that way, the actual rescue of the guy by this foreign intervention and the big surge in military event, and the coup in Turkey all helped to reshape Turkish ideas about what should happen in Syria to emphasize containing the growing power of Kurds in the southern border of Turkey and not caring so much about the future of al-Assad anymore, which really was one of the two or three things that kind of killed the ambition of the Gulf countries to get rid of a pro-Iranian regime in Damascus and replace it with a neutral or an anti-Iranian regime, therefore taking away this major Iranian asset. The Turkish interest in that kind of went away. And there was this period of almost confrontation in Syria where the groups that were supported directly or indirectly by Gulf countries were almost being targeted by Turkey, and there was a real confrontation of interest there. And I think what you've seen is that under the rubric of a Trump administration policy that's becoming much more coherent in Syria and is focused on doing exactly what the Gulf countries were hoping for, which is working, first of all, on the ground to block Iranian interests, especially from creating a military corridor through Iraq and Syria to the Mediterranean. That seems to be out. I mean, a year and a half ago, I would have said that may well happen, but it's not going to, largely because of the Trump administration not leaving Syria. But in addition, there's a move by the Trump administration to start a dialogue with Turkey especially, but also with Russia, try to see what can be done to marginalize the Iranians, to make sure that Tehran is not the big winner in Syria and limit their gains. And so this is all very positive. So all of that kind of indicates the way in which Saudi Arabia and Turkey can still find themselves roughly on the same side. At the same time, you've just seen Turkey enter into a new military cooperation agreement with Kuwait, which again raises this fear of A, a new Turkish hegemony, and B, the emergence of a camp that could even stretch out to incorporate countries that most people couldn't imagine being part of it. And again, I mentioned Jordan and Kuwait as possibilities. Now, it may be fanciful, but when you see new military cooperation agreements, that tends to exacerbate fears. So what we end up with then is a really kind of bipolar, pendular relationship. And let me just say, I want to end by thoroughly endorsing Ambassador Crocker's comment about there being no bottom in the Middle East. You know, things can always get worse, right? That's for sure. And, you know, as usual, kind of Shakespeare wrote it best. Edgar in King Lear says, this is not the worst so long as we can still say this is the worst. And I think that's exactly right, and that's always the case.
Thank you. Sure. So, Dr. Aras? Any more cards for us?
Well, thanks for all participating in this conference, and I'd like to first thank the Middle East Policy Council for inviting me, and I'll say a word about my involvement with Middle East Policy Council. I published my first academic article back in 1998 in Middle East Policy. That's why it's always an important journal for me, and since then I continue to publish. I think that's the reason you invited me to talk on Saudi Arabian-Turkish rivalry in the Middle East. I'm not surprised that, you know, I agreed with what Dr. Ibish said in his speech, and that's the result of rational thinking. But I'm not referring here, he's the more rational Turks or the Saudis. I don't like to carry this, who is more rational content between the leadership to here, but I certainly agree what he said so far in many areas. First of all, I'd like to start with a warning, and I believe it will be a false start to evaluate Turkish-Saudi Arabian relations merely as a rivalry. It's rather, you know, it may be defined as concurrent elements of competition and cooperation together. If we go back to AKP's coming to power, it was indeed a welcome development in Saudi Arabia, since the President Erdogan, the former President Gül, and their efforts to mend defenses with the Arab world and in general Muslim world has been considered as an asset in Saudi Arabia back then. And don't forget, the Saudis nodded to election of a Turkish professor as Secretary General of the OIC. This would never happen without Saudi approval. Back then, the Professor Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu. From Saudi perspective, at the outset, Erdogan was an asset as a pro-Western Middle Eastern leader, and the Saudis also approved, the fast-growing Turkish GCC relations back mid-2000s. Indeed, I also published a piece at Middle East Policy on Turkey and the GCC. Back then, there was a bright prospect between Turkey and Saudi Arabia within the framework of the GCC. The game changer here has been the Arab Spring and the Turkish position in the Arab Spring, Turkish support to Muslim Brotherhood movements, and in general, this what has been called in Turkey as electoral transition in those countries. And that means, the popular vote, which at the end means, political Islam and Muslim Brotherhood. But beyond this, and of course this position almost has been an anathema of the Saudi position, which desires to go back to, pro-Arab Spring status quo. But however, beyond the differences in ideology, there was also, the Turkey's increase in influence in North Africa, in Central Asia, Levant, and even in Yemen. So And also, as an example of this concurrent elements of cooperation and competition, Syria is a very good example. At the outset, both wanted to overthrow Assad regime in Syria, but later on it turned out that this issue became a matter of rivalry or competition, conflict between those, since they supported different kind of transition in Syria and they backed different groups in Syria, while the overall and overarching common goal of throwing Assad in Syria. Well, there have been a brief period, even after Arab Spring or during the Arab Spring in 2015, after the demise of King Abdullah, there was a chance of rapprochement or approximation between these two countries. And at that time, Erdogan followed wise policy of increasing his rhetoric of condemnation of Iran. He backed Saudi position in Yemen, and all he wanted is Saudi support in return in Syria. And if you remember the early 2015, this Saudi-Turkish position brought Assad to the brink of collapse in 2015, but it didn't survive much, and mostly because of Erdogan's reticence to back wider Saudi designs, for example, this army of Islam against Iran. Well, this divergence has been very costly to Turkey. Although, there was a brief period that at least there was a sense that Obama administration is supporting Turkey's position in the beginning, but other than it's not possible to argue that Turkey's gained much following this course of line in the Arab Spring. Syria became a major burden, isolated Turkey from the Middle East, and regional instability and insecurity hurt Turkish interests, Turkish access to Arab markets, and the Gulf finance in a wider sense. And also on the Saudi side, it was a strategic blunder, I believe, to alienate Turkey and their clumsy effort to contain Iran. There is also a UAE factor here. Back in 2011, in particular in Libya case, UAE adopted an emotional position against Turkey. Why Turkey is choosing Qatar, the rising, shining Gulf, the country UAE. And this UAE line against Turkey has been able to convince the Saudi Arabia, according to the Turkish perception of what's happening in the Gulf. The UAE line has been successful to persuade Saudis that Turkey and Qatar are enemies who are open to Iranian position, and they are danger to pro-Western Saudi Arabia and UAE in the region. Well, the feelings are mutual. There was this widening distaste against the UAE. The pro-government circles believe in that UAE was behind the failed coup against Turkish government, and of course with Saudi approval. Well, in the meantime, looking at the U.S. factor for Turkish leadership, for the AKP, they had a euphoric welcome for Trump administration. Their perspective was the new president is gonna, find the common ground with Turkey and Syria. They are gonna extradite this Turkish Islamic preacher Fethullah Gülen, who lives in the United States, to Turkey, and even they are gonna adopt, a tougher stance in Syria that will isolate Iran in Syria. But Turkey, in return, got Saudi, UAE, Trump alliance, which hurt Turkish interests in Syria, and which is following a destabilizing line against Iran, which will eventually lead to the constructive spillover impact in Turkey. While this euphoric welcome has turned out to a disappointment in a short period of time, and there is here a UAE-Saudi factor in this disappointment. Well, the blockade against Qatar in June 2017 has been also considered as a, this final move against Turkey to isolate Turkey from the Gulf, Middle East, and even beyond. And that's why Turkey took, a vital action to provide, the daily products to Qatar, to save Qatar against the Saudi-led coalition. And they, reinforced the Turkish military presence over there to prevent any kind of maneuver against, the pro-Turkish Sheikh Tamim. Well, at that time, there was also, this Erdogan's attempt to mediate between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. That may be an example to bipolarity Dr. Ibish was referring. But however, that has been rebuffed by the Saudis that, it's too late. And later on, it turned out that, the Turkish military presence became a strong part of the Saudi ultimatum against Qatar. Well, there is a Mohammed bin Salman factor here. He is the elephant in the room when it comes to Turkish-Saudi relations. Well, there are many conspiratorial reports, arguments, if you follow the Turkish media. But however, it's real that, the Mohammed bin Salman himself in March 2018 called Turkey as a part of, axis of, an axis of evil, like part of a coalition that Iran and Daesh also takes place. I believe this was a, his outburst of the confrontational approach that both sides adopted, and now we see that both sides are unable to recover. And in particular, from Turkish perspective, due to Mohammed bin Salman's decision to eliminate all rivals in the region. Well, Mohammed bin Salman's agenda to gather an anti-Iran bloc in the region, his assertive moves from Yemen to Qatar, and willingness to ally with Israel, I believe alienated Turkish expectation to co-opt Saudis in any way in their regional policy. While the Crown Prince's, unwavering opposition to Muslim Brotherhood, hence the Turkish and the Qatari position left no room for cooperation at the moment. Well, again, going back to UAE role, UAE is, as orchestrating, the openly anti-Turkish efforts in all possible platforms, from Sudan to Somalia to Washington and the Western capital. And it was never lost on the Turkish foreign policy elite that UAE funded a number of UN members in Turkey's bid for, membership to the UN Security Council. And this is going to be never lost on Turkish foreign policy elite, because that resulted in, a kind of humiliation of Turkish defeat with around 60 votes out of 193. Just, few years earlier, this was a reverse, and Turkey, even unanimously elected as member of UN Security Council. So, well, if we come to Khashoggi case, it certainly helped Erdogan to gain a moral ground in regional politics. And I think this is the start of this rationality discussion that, that hurts Saudi Arabia, UAE line in the region. Well, it's not a secret that Ankara will utilize any possible means to limit Mohammed bin Salman's role in Saudi politics. Well, and probably to encourage, the other moderate elements, if there are any, in Saudi politics. Well, even some degree, here the expectation is not to change Saudi domestic landscape, but even some progress will be considered a success in Turkey. Well, we are here referring to a very delicate relationship with Saudi Arabia after Khashoggi case. Well, on the one hand, Turkey certainly wants to have access to Gulf finance, but on the other hand, it finds itself, in the middle of this dangerous Turkish-Iranian rivalry. And here there is, an emerging rival leader in Saudi Arabia. So what Turkey can do is to use the Khashoggi case to weaken Mohammed bin Salman, but keeping King Salman and the Saudi Arabia aside. And then, it's a tightrope, but however, there is a belief that this can work to preserve the relations with Saudi Arabia while weakening Mohammed bin Salman's role in Saudi politics or his assertive line against Turkey. But that's a matter of time to see. But however, I'm, almost 100% sure that Turkey cannot put its domestic integrity into further risks with directly confronting either Saudi Arabia or Iran. That's out of possibility. And we see it, while Erdogan is playing Khashoggi case very well, but however, there is a certain degree of caution as well. That's why, my analysis on the Khashoggi affair and its aftermath is that it is actually a negotiation to moderate the attritional rivalry and consolidate Turkish interests in the Gulf. But this is aside from the humanitarian tragedy that I wish that would never happen. Well, overall, the UAE-Qatar rivalry is a major setback for Gulf stability. And the Gulf crisis in itself underlines to find a common ground among the GCC. So in order to make the rationality discussion and the rationality in terms of leadership, change the region, the U.S. role, etc. First, there is a need to put the house in order, and then probably we can talk of rationality. And the U.S. funded or led cold peace is not going to bring a peace to the geography, and which will continue this ongoing rifts and will alienate other actors which can indeed play some roles. Well, from my perspective, Turkey and Saudi Arabia needs to find a common ground on regional matters, which will certainly calm many issues in that geography, from Palestinian questions, even in Yemen. Saudis can play a role to put an end to the Turkish-Egyptian rift. And that can start from here in a way that Turkey can provide a counterbalancing role in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, which I believe Saudi Arabia needs very much. If we are talking about working together towards a regional common end, such a common ground is a necessity, and I believe there is room for reconciliation between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. These are two major Sunni powers. Probably Erdogan's transformation of Turkey may help in that sense that Turkey and Saudi Arabia may understand each other better in comparison to the earlier terms. But however, it certainly requires Saudi's distances from anti-Qatar position and moderation towards the Muslim Brotherhood. You may think, this is not realistic, but the alternative is the illusory perspectives of any stability and peace. Well, thinking more academically, I'm the professor of international relations and geopolitics. What I see is, geopolitical crimes committed by all sides, and I believe, the choice is now between continuing to commit these geopolitical crimes for authoritarian survival at home, keeping the power, domestic hold on power, or a little bit sacrificing from it towards a common ground for addressing the crisis in the geography. And this is all what I'm going to say for now. Thank you.
Any more cards?
First, I'd like to thank everyone for good presentations. And I think it would be good if we could come out of this meeting with some ideas for the future of American policy. So we might begin with an issue that was touched on but maybe not covered enough, which would be this. When Turkey and Saudi Arabia both look at the international system and look at maybe declining American power and influence and commitment and engagement after the certainly over the last 10 or 15 years. And when they consider perhaps advice that they've given to the United States that hasn't been followed, as for example, King Abdullah advising the United States not to invade Iraq, which then left the door open for Iran to enter the region, or the Turks not being happy about the way the U.S. enabled the Kurds to have autonomy in Iraq in the 1990s and beyond, or the way the United States did not engage deeply enough in Syria after 2011. To what extent has this changing global picture and the changing role of American power and engagement at the same time that Russia started to come back into the region, how has this influenced decisions that both countries have taken that have alienated the other one, or that have helped to create the rivalry and the disagreements in places like Syria and elsewhere, and vis-a-vis Iran too? Can we start with that? Anyone who wants to?
I could. To turn this on? Yeah, there we go. All right, so Saudi Arabia has had to play a much more robust and forward-leading role in the region for three reasons. First, because it feels threatened by the rise of Iran, and it's not going to fail to act on that. And that's just a circumstance that would have warranted a more robust Saudi regional posture anyway. Right? Secondly is the collapse of the traditional centers of our Arab power and influence. Cairo is looking inward, Damascus is ripped apart, Baghdad is, from a national point of view, post-apocalyptic almost. So these power centers, traditional power centers in the Arab world, are non-functional. And they either simply can't rule their own territory, or, as in the case of Egypt, they look abroad in such a limited way that it constitutes an extension of domestic policy. For example, Egypt's concern in Gaza is not really a foreign, it's more of a domestic policy issue. Same with Libya. I mean, there's such a geographical proximity that it becomes very hard to see this as projecting power much further than the border. It's it's in the same way that I think Turkey's concern about Kurds, especially in Syria, is again almost more of a domestic issue than a foreign policy issue. So because of this vacuum of Arab leadership, I think Saudi Arabia has had to step up, UAE too, some Qatar in its own way. There's just a vacuum of Arab leadership. And the third is the decreased role of the United States that you pointed out. And in that context, then, I think all these three things come together, particularly the relative pulling back of the United States during the Obama administration. But as I think Trump's America First policies, though they're hard to read, they haven't been very coherently defined yet, but they look like extending some of Obama's caution, right? And the idea that you really, the last thing you want is another war in the Middle East and stuff like that, and that other countries, the notion of burden sharing. If there's one idea that's consistent between Obama's foreign policy and Trump's foreign policy, is this emphasis on burden sharing that they both have, and that, to Saudi eyes, translates into fight your own wars. Now, for them, they've done that in Yemen, right? All they've asked for is some support, and now they're getting crucified for it. Now, of course, it's no problem making the case against the Yemen war, both in theory and in practice, and that's not a problem. But I'm just saying, from the point of view of burden sharing, it's problematic to lecture a country like Saudi Arabia ad nauseum about how they need to fight their own wars, and then when they do, you get extremely upset and put sanctions on them. So I mean, I'm not attacking any of this. I'm just saying think about it in terms of burden sharing, and becomes very problematic. Now, the relative vacuum that the U.S. sets up, and there was a sense that the U.S. was looking into a potential arrangement with Iran that didn't, because of the JCPOA, that didn't pan out. And there's a real anxiety about not just the American presence, but the reliability of the United States. So all of this prompts Saudi Arabia to take a more robust role. And then this is magnified by the role first as defense minister and then as the crown prince of Mohammed bin Salman, who is a very audacious, let's put it that way, in at times certainly reckless leader. And so you combine all of that, and you've got, within the limitations of what they can do, a fairly aggressive Saudi regional policy. I think Turkey has defined it, since the coup especially, has defined its interests more narrowly than before. But where they have identified something as a crucial interest, for example, preventing the rise of a unified PKK statelet in northern Syria, they have intervened very forcefully to stop it, even to the point of almost confronting American troops, right, in Manbij and places like that, which did not happen, but was on the brink of happening and could have happened. So what I'm suggesting ultimately is that the lack of U.S. or the reduction of U.S. leadership and the sense, at least in Riyadh and possibly in Ankara as well, probably, I defer to you on that, that the U.S. is not only less assertive but less reliable, creates a situation where these countries, not just Saudi Arabia and Turkey, but others, are looking to define and secure their own interests, independent of the United States, and are operating in an unstable area where terms of reference and balance of power is being negotiated in real time, right, and in a very changing kaleidoscopic environment. And that, I think, does exacerbate a sense of rivalry, a sense of anxiety, a sense of confrontation, et cetera. What do you think?
I believe you said that it was actually the Russian intervention in Syria that broke apart the Turkish-Saudi agreement on who to support there. Oh, sorry, Hussein. Mm-hmm. And that from that point on, you had Turkey more concerned about containing the Kurds, and therefore you have a confrontational policy because the Gulf Arabs had been supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces and the YPG, and
right.
I mean that's something that Turkey objects to. That actually has something to do with the relationship between the United States and Russia, and who's involved and who's engaged and who isn't.
Well, if we're talking about Russia, is it open? Yeah. Well, if you are talking about Russia, the Turkish-Russian relations or the complications in Syria is out of a necessity, because when Turkey, downed the Russian jet in Syria, there was a brief moment of expectation in Turkey that there's going to be, regional and the U.S. support to Turkey. If you all want to, the limit Russian role in Syria, this was a perfect, opportunity. But that did not. Yeah, that didn't happen. And, the earlier on, when President Obama said, the Assad is not a legitimate leader and he must go, up to that point, Turkey did not seize the relation with Assad regime. But despite, this enormous domestic pressure, Erdogan kept the relation with the Assad regime. But after that, there was an expectation that United States is going to do something. But it turned out to a presidential brainstorming or something, an intellectual declaration, and it did not happen too. So it was, a self-help from a realist point of view to ally with Russia to pursue, this Turkish military operation against the PKK to prevent, this emergence of wider PKK state over there. That's, mostly out of necessity. But when it comes to, the Astana talks, the Turkey, Iran, and Russia, Turkey has, a different perspective on Iran in Syria. Well, Turkey certainly wants to isolate Iran in Syria. But however, Turkey considers Iran part of, solution too. So there should be, there is still belief that there is room for diplomacy with Iran. So there should be, a more complicated, multi-leveled approach according to Ankara against Iran. The Iranian role should be limited inside Syria, but however, diplomatically also Iran should be persuaded to, act responsibly in Syria, which will ever happen. That's again a matter of time to see.
Ambassador Crocker, do you want to comment on this American-Russian involvement?
Yes, the fact that everything worth listening to has been said won't stop me from saying it again. Hussein in particular touches on, I think, a core issue here. It's what is the role of the U.S. not just in this region, but globally. These 7+ decades since the end of World War II. I mean, we in America created the post-war world order, if you will. I mean, United Nations came out of the San Francisco Conference. The post-war international financial order out of Bretton Woods. That would be Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, not Bretton Woods, France. And of course, NATO. You flash back to the end of World War I, where the U.S. Basically was sidelined by the French and the British, certainly sidelined in this region. And what we got then, you got a 2-decade truce between two halves of a horrific world war. That's all it was. 1918, 1938. Yeah. Well, with U.S. leadership internationally since World War II, we have seen a world, in spite of things like Vietnam, that has been broadly at peace in a way it never was before. So before we kind of say, damn, the Senate was right to vote down the League of Nations thing, I wish we could do that again, consider the consequences. If we do not lead, who will? I fear the answer to that is no one will lead, because no one can. It's not that I stay up nights worrying about the Chinese taking over the world. It's that the Chinese, nor anyone else, is not going to be able even to manage conflict. And as we look at what's happening in Turkey, what's happening in Saudi Arabia, we kind of see the, where this could go. And again, this, as you so rightly point out, and I think both of you have made this point, this did not start with President Trump. Right. It started with President Obama. Yeah. Now, Trump has elevated it to an art form by, pulling us out of the TPP and the Paris Climate Agreement, and the JCPOA, which, by the way, again, some in the Obama administration totally oversold that to our peril and loss by pretending it was more than what it was, and what it was is a reasonably good arms control agreement, not a treaty of peace and friendship. But that spooked the Saudis and the rest of the Gulf. So again, what are the consequences going down the line? Saudi Arabia, for example, as you point out, took a look around and said, well, we're on our own here. So we're going to go whack the Yemenis because they desperately need it. They let us know, 48 hours, 72 hours before, and that was done mill to mill to Lloyd Austin, who was in Central Command. And the Saudis weren't asking.
No.
They were telling us, we're going in, you've got some enablers we really, really would like to have, and we hope you'll give them to us, but if you don't, we're going anyway. Well, for someone of my generation, that was unthinkable, that the Saudis would ever be in that kind of position. And I think you, as you say quite rightly, that may not be where they wanted to be, but it is where they are. And then the irony of us not having been there at the creation are now saying it's not going well, you need to pull out. But that's also a reality if you look at the Senate vote yesterday, or day before. Just a couple of other quick things. The Turks and the Kurds. I was very much involved in the run-up to March 2003 as Deputy Assistant Secretary covering the Gulf with the effort to make our efforts in Iraq as successful as they could possibly be. One key element of that was having a northern front to bring the 4th Infantry Division down through Turkey and into northern Iraq. Well, that didn't happen, thanks to the Turkish General Staff largely, that managed to see that what at first looked like parliamentary approval was actually not, because there were not enough deputies to make it legal. We were prepared to give the Turks very wide latitude vis-a-vis the Iraqi Kurds. Dangerously wide, in my view, as someone involved in our processes. So if the Turks have encountered problems with Iraqi Kurds, they have only themselves to blame. Had that vote succeeded, it would be a totally different landscape, literally, in northern Iraq. I just toss that out there. I don't know how widely known it is, but it was highly significant at the time. The other thing I'd point out, and I know this sounds like minutia, but these things count. We, of course, have had a long, strong mill-to-mill relationship with Turkey. Turkey is a major customer for our weapons systems. Right now, we're working on an F-35 sale of very large proportions. Boy, but you know what? If Turkey actually goes ahead with that S-400 air defense system from Russia, I don't think that F-35 sale is going to go. Not for political reasons. It's because it would almost certainly compromise our most advanced technologies to the Russians through that system. So don't get lost in the details, but some of these things get very, very important as you're looking ahead to what kind of relationship we're going to have.
Well, before we come back to American policy and what influence it has had on this rivalry, let's come to something you said, Hussein. It is, where do the interests of the state begin and end compared to where the interests of Erdogan begin and end? What is it about, is there something about the nature of these two states, Turkey being, well, having some post-Ottoman grievances that carried all the way through the 1920s until today, and having different, ethnic and sectarian makeup, and being a democratic country on the one hand, and then Saudi Arabia having some grievances against the Ottoman Empire for the fall of the first two houses of Saud, and seeing itself as the custodian of the two holy mosques, having pride in its own form of government, which has taken the country from from sand into modern economy and society. To what extent do these differences in the nature of the state contribute to the rivalry or make competition difficult? And then you come to Erdogan, the man, and MBS, the man, where you have one person who feels, Erdogan feels rebuffed by the West, specifically about not getting into the EU, and is an Islamist, and is committed to Sunni Islamism, whereas MBS is someone who is trying to engineer top-down change and does think that their Salafism is worth defending, and that their form of government is worth defending against the different vision that is being espoused by Turkey. You have the nature of the state, you have the nature of the two men. We'll talk about that a little bit in terms of why they have different policies.
Well, of course, I'm not, the part of government, or I'm not a policy person anymore. And what I say is a pure academic analysis. My sense is that Mohammed bin Salman, reminds King Abdullah in Turkey. So when King Salman came to power, it was a very welcome development in Turkey that a less assertive but more rational, wise king. He's going to follow more moderate policies, a rational containment policy against Iran, a wiser Western line in the region, and mostly when this power shift happened to Mohammed bin Salman. So this, kind of has been what we call in the psychology some sort of return of the repressed. There's former feelings towards Saudi Arabia under King Abdullah. Well, looking from two different perspectives in Turkey, there is still a secular urban people good enough to protect the Turkey's modernization. Up to Arab Spring, Erdogan was also using this as an asset and still using it. He and most of his people, they are products of Turkey's modern secular system. They are graduates of those universities, the education system. Well, Erdogan talks about a new generation, so on and so forth. But all those generations are going to be the graduates of the same system. He did not initiate a new education system, a new education thinking. Well, what he says mostly have to consolidate its support basis. But the Turkish state and the lots of years of the modernization experience is still over there, and it's going to resist. But Erdogan is now the only leader who can have the majority support, and this change from parliamentary system to presidential system made him the only possible leader for a foreseeable future. So only possible way to get him out of picture was the coup, which is undesirable thing in any democracy, and it also failed. So here, from Erdogan's perspective, he has, the majority support at home. But however, there are still, outside powers who are trying to figure out how to get rid of him. So this psychology, the survival psychology, is not prevalent. But I think he's going to get over it not much later. Don't forget, this constitutional system change, all the elections, this political lift with the Gülen group. There has been so many wars. One man can fight one war at a time, but he's fighting many wars. So this psychology of survival is guiding him at the moment, and his political elite, and which is also sidelining Turkish state away. That's why, But Dr. Ibish said Erdogan and the state, there is, seemingly this difference, but it is gonna converge at some point. Otherwise, it is not sustainable. It will, fall apart. Well, again, from an academic perspective, Erdogan and Mohammed bin Salman get along. If they can find the common ground that, if Mohammed bin Salman gives an image that he can control UAE, he can follow, a balanced Iran destabilization project. This is what Erdogan likes to hear now. But however, Mohammed bin Salman is, he is an emerging leader, and he made clear that he's going to eliminate all the rivals, Muslim Brotherhood, and Turkey is part of Muslim Brotherhood, and he is certain to eliminate them. So if there is a common ground, Erdogan, what most matter Erdogan is this, not Muslim Brotherhood, but Islamic Brotherhood. He can forget all about and get along with it, like he did with Putin. In 2015, after the downing of Russian jet, it sounded that he and Putin will never get along. But now you see, they on daily basis they are talking on the phone, etc. I see, looking at his practical side and looking to the way he needs to lead Turkey, I see, from an optimist perspective, I'm always an optimist and an academic, I see a likely convergence ahead.
Yeah.
Did I understand you to say that he's pragmatic enough to distance himself from the Muslim Brotherhood? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, I also don't share, the AKP is a Muslim Brotherhood party. Yeah. Well, one color is that, but also there are other colors which can limit that.
Yeah.
With regard to MBS in Saudi Arabia, I mean, it's the decision-making process in Saudi Arabia not only is murky, it's always been murky. It's harder than Kremlinology. It's a more complex puzzle. The dearth of good information, knowledgeable sources, etc., makes it almost a fool's game. I do think, though, we can be sure of two things. Number one is that MBS, young, audacious, etc., has an enormous amount of power, and the degree to which the changes that he has overseen in the past 2 years constitute an autogolpe, a self-coup, which I've been calling it from the beginning since the Ritz-Carlton thing, can't be overstated. The old system of Saudi Arabia, which was monarchical and sort of a modern feudalism with different fiefdoms and checks and balances and accountability within the royal family, and all that is pretty much wrecked. And there's been a tremendous concentration of power around the crown prince. But it also needs to be said that the authority for all of this comes from the king. In other words, the king is a non-controversial figure relatively in Saudi Arabia. His authority is uncontested. His right to be king is uncontested. His authority is really uncontested. Mohammed bin Salman does what he does precisely because of the sense that he's doing it all under the rubric of the king, that the king has delegated all of this to him. And don't forget, this is a king who has already replaced a crown prince, right? Crown Prince Nayef was removed, and Mohammed bin Salman was put in as crown prince. And in fact, even before that, it was done. So the point is that it is not unthinkable that from a structural point of view, that Mohammed bin Salman would not be the king. However, the amount of bureaucratic power that he has assembled and the apparent commitment of King Salman to his succession means that, in fact, he will be king. Now, there's this very strange reality where he can't be king because he's become so radioactive in Washington. It'd be very hard for him to come here, but he can't not be king because he's going to become king. We'll see how they figure that one out. But the point I'm making is that while I can't In Turkey, it's easier to distinguish between national and institutional prerogatives and the political or personal prerogatives. In Saudi Arabia, it's all deliberately, but systemically and in theory mixed up, right? It's a monarchy, absolute monarchy. So it's l'état is supposed to be moi. It's not, this isn't an accident or a weird thing. At the same time, and in fact, that's one of the big differences between where ideologically Saudi Arabia and Turkey, insofar as Turkey serves as a model for anybody, would immediately come into a problem, is the republicanism of the Turkish model, of the AKP model, of the brotherhood model in the Arab world. I agree, AKP is not exactly a brotherhood party, but it is a Sunni Islamist and Republican party. So it's in that sense, well, majoritarian, yeah, if you can. That would be, yeah, no, I understand what you mean. I think you're right. And none of that's true of Saudi Arabia. Now, I just do want to say one thing in addition. This business of Islamism is, I think you're absolutely right to locate the fundamental contradiction here between Turkey and its allies like Qatar on the one hand and UAE on the other hand. UAE is the party in the region that is categorically opposed, unequivocally, to all forms of political Islam and the politicization of Islam and the Islamization of politics. Any version of that is anathema to Abu Dhabi's perspective and to UAE's perspective. They are committed to what amounts to secular politics in the region and to separation of religion and politics. Now this, of course, is not really true of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia in a post-Arab Spring moment, particularly under MBS, is certainly anti-Muslim brotherhood to a very large extent, and anti-Islamist in a more general sense, in a way. But you can't have Saudi Arabia standing for a total break between religion and politics, because Saudi Arabia presents itself as a religious state, as the custodian of the mosques, and as a pure Islamic state with the Quran as its constitution and all that stuff. So it's not possible. Secondly, and you could say, well, there's a difference between status quo Islamic politics and revolutionary Islamic politics, or Republican versus monarchical, all this. Okay. The point is there is no clear break in Saudi Arabia the way there is in the UAE. The second thing is that MBS is not categorically, unwaveringly opposed to all Muslim brothers, the way that the UAE is. The example here is Yemen. All right. Saudi Arabia, in the northern part of Yemen, where it has been operating, has been increasingly working with Al-Islah, which is a Muslim Brotherhood party in Yemen, which presents itself as part of this wave of post-Islamist groups led by Nahda and also the Justice and Development in Morocco, etc., who've broken with three aspects of Muslim Brotherhood structure that are noxious and toxic to Arab governments, which is a revolutionary nature, conspiratorial nature, i.e. illegal underground, and especially and above all transnational. So these groups say, well, we're not revolutionary, we don't want to change the system, we're not conspiratorial, we're not doing anything in secret, and we're not transnational. In other words, Nahda only comments on Tunisia and Tunisian foreign policy. Doesn't talk about Sudan or anything like that. And Al-Islah takes this position. Jordanian Muslim brothers take this position. The Moroccan Islamists take this position. And it's one that I think in the end Saudi Arabia could easily end up living with, because it doesn't threaten a return to Arab Spring or revolutionary or anything. It doesn't really threaten. UAE
threaten the state.
Doesn't threaten the state. Well, okay, so that would potentially be a Saudi perspective. UAE, I think, would find all of it threatening, and so there's a big distinction. So I just wanted to say, you can imagine that in the next decades, that if Erdogan emerges, is now recast as part of a post-Islamist movement with the lacking those three qualities, the revolutionary, conspiratorial, and transnational that I talked about, that Saudi Arabia could become very comfortable with that, potentially, or not.
We have less than 15 minutes, so can we get into American policy now? Is there a way for the United States to re-engage, to support both of these traditional allies, in a way that helps them resolve some of their differences and helps us contain our adversaries. I think Turkey, for example, would not be happy with an Iranian nuclear weapon. Turkey is not happy with Iran's expansion on the ground through the Shia Crescent to the Mediterranean. So how do we harness them together in this endeavor better than we've been doing? And what is it that Erdogan wants from the Khashoggi incident that he would need to get? And is it going to be necessary for MBS to make some concessions because of the Khashoggi matter? And is it useful for the United States to be imposing sanctions on Turkey and Saudi Arabia if we're going to be trying to bring them closer together in an effort to contain our common enemies, common adversaries, which includes Russia, not only Iran? That's a big question, but it's a question about what should American policy be now. Ambassador Crocker, do you want to talk first about that?
Sure. I think we can all be very brief here because what American policy? This has been a very interesting conversation to me thus far. In my remarks, I tried to point out that in obviously different roles, Saudi Arabia and Turkey have been absolutely critical partners in the post-World War II international order. And I think that behooves us, before we let all this drift away, to go sit under a tree somewhere and consider what our vital interests are, what they have been and where they're likely to go, and then bring regional partners, traditional regional partners, into the conversation. What does Turkey envision as the gains it would like to make? What are the losses they seek to avoid? Same thing elsewhere. But if you're going to do that, you've got to have a policy. Right. And we're kind of short in that department. I'd like to say it's just the Middle East, but it seems to be pretty well global right now, and I just go back to that kind of waking nightmare. If not us, then who? If not us, with what consequences for our own security and for international security? And I find that a fairly frightening view right about now. On the plus side, I think we've heard from both of my colleagues here that there is a flexibility and a pragmatism really in both leaderships. Yep. To who they could live with and who they can't. And I certainly garnered from that we would have a lot to work with.
Oh, yes.
In Ankara and in Riyadh if we had a framework to work from. Right. This isn't helped, of course, by the fact that this administration has not seen fit to move expeditiously, if at all, on things like ambassadorial or geographic assistant secretary appointments. Right. Almost 2 years in, you don't have ambassadors in kind of really important places like Riyadh. So,
nominee, though.
Yes, yeah, great nominee. Though that does raise another question. John Abu Zaid, of course, a career soldier, not a diplomat. Right. In modern times, we've sent 2 career diplomats to Riyadh, both Arabists, Jim Aiken and Hugh Moran. Boy, the Saudis didn't like either of them, and both left short of tour. Sure. What they don't seem to want in the kingdom is someone with the background and the skills to make, say, the politics of the royal family a little less opaque than they are. Right. Because opaque is what they want.
Opaque is what they want.
Now, I don't think John Abu Zaid is a fluent Arabic speaker, but he certainly knows the kingdom and he knows the region. So let's see how he does out there. Obviously, this would be the worst possible time for the Saudis to take issue with who we send to Riyadh, and he has had agrément, of course, but so did Hugh Moran until they found out how deeply he could get into their society. So again, not to get lost in the weeds there, but you know, I think what we've done here is to convince ourselves of how important these relationships really are, and that we've got a lot to work with as well as against. But then that just puts us back on the that overarching question. You can't do any of this without a policy.
Can I just say, I mean, I think from the Saudi perspective, a return of U.S. leadership would be most welcome, and there would be a tremendous lot to work with. I'll defer to my colleague on Ankara's perspective, but I think the Saudis would be are hoping for a much more robust American presence, and they've clearly have bitten off more than they can chew in some places, and in other places, like in Syria, they're relying entirely on the United States to indirectly pursue their interests. And in Iraq, it's got to be a collaborative effort by Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and others working politically and financially to incentivize the Iraqis to come back into the Arab fold and get distance from Iran, with the United States playing its role. And I think Iran has a problem in Iraq when it faces a combination of what the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait bring to the table. But confronting any of those three on their own, I think Iran is in much better shape to continue to wield undue authority in Iraq. So it's a good example of where these countries actually need each other, even to succeed in the very limited policies that are being pursued right now. So there's a tremendous lot to work with, yeah.
Well, I don't know to what extent you are following the developments in Iran, but you know the destabilization of Iran is a very likely prospect. What you know the President Trump is doing, and you know out of this Sunni Shiite revolution, Iran may come on the brink of collapse sooner than we assume. So we have you know Iranian destabilization on the prospect, and what we need to deal with Syria and Yemen. So there should be a simultaneous policy to stabilize Syria and Yemen in order to deal with this this emergent destabilization. It's gonna have enormous spillover effect to Iraq, to Iran, to Afghanistan, to Central Asia. So how we are going to deal with? Okay, there's tough guys, the powerful leaders. They agreed on to destabilize in Iran, but how they are going to handle it?
Is that a policy for reducing Iran's influence in Yemen, Iraq, and Syria?
But
destabilizing Iran.
But I don't know what's going to happen afterwards. So there should be a policy to deal with that, but also there should be simultaneous policies to work harder on Syria and Yemen to at least handle that one. So that signal, a kind of signal from Saudi Arabia, from the United States, that there is a clear plan and policy on Iran, as well as a renewed engagement to Yemen and Syria is going to be very good signal to Ankara to persuade it to be on the board in all those initiatives. But before seeing the agenda or the future policy on Iran in Turkey is going to try very hard, like we have seen in this pre-U.S. invasion of Iraq. We'll see similar developments and lots of disappointment between these countries.
Can I add one very quick thing? It occurs to me that it's worth saying that a strong U.S. engagement, strong assertion of American leadership would be so welcome in Riyadh that if there were over a short period of time a re-establishment of trust and confidence in the United States could even shift to trying to be a balancing power in the region with success and with the backing of Riyadh. It's what makes it so hard is not that U.S. policy isn't pleasing to. It's that there's no confidence. If there's confidence and trust, you could have even a more challenging policy and be successful.
I've tried to reflect a lot of the questions that came out of the audience here, but there's one I want to read, actually read it, and it's for Ambassador Crocker. We'll make it the last question. If you were to write a new version of the Perfect Storm memo, what would your central and main warning be to the current administration?
It would be pretty much what it would have been with the previous administration. And again, I know this is getting repetitive, but it's important enough to repeat. Do not cast aside American global leadership without some very careful consideration of the consequences. Now, we've talked about that in the Middle Eastern context. Well, take a look at Europe.
Yep.
The rise of forces throughout Europe, basically, of extreme right-wing orientation. I'm, among other things, on the Broadcasting Board of Governors. We oversee Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, all official USG civilian media. We have restarted our Hungarian language service through Radio Free Europe out of concern of the way the current government seems to be controlling individual liberties and press liberties. And you may have seen the stories over the last couple of days, how they are shutting down their own media now. Why is this important? Because horrific things have come out of Europe in the 20th century. 2 world wars and the Holocaust. And World War II and the Holocaust are still in living memory. Do we really think that kind of thing can never happen again? That we have reached the end of history, and Frank Fukuyama wishes to hell he'd never written that book, and has been honest enough to say so. So yes, our post-World War II effort was directed at containment of the Soviets, but a subtext was European unity, not just against the Soviet Union, but European unity under U.S. leadership to structurally start to develop the institutions and the orientations that would make a return to that kind of conflict and genocides impossible. Well, we can see now how possible that might get. So it isn't just the Middle East. It isn't just the Middle East and Europe. By abdicating in East Asia, well, the Chinese are building new islands every day, which they're using now for air and sea basing. So again, my message would not be on the Middle East, except by example. It would be on the world. What kind of world do we want to see, and what are its implications for us?
I just want to say that within a day or so, the video of this conference will be on our website, which is www.mepc.org. And then this transcript will be in the next issue of the journal, which will be the Winter 2018 Journal, which will be out probably after Christmas. And having said that, I want to thank the panel very much for a great discussion, in my view.
Oh, that was great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.